The FIDE World Cup 2017 began today in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, and what an event this is. 128 players, it's a knockout tournament, and anyone in the chess world is playing. So there's Kramnik, Aronian, Vachier-Lagrave, Anand, Wei Yi, Caruana, Nakamura, Wesley So. I mean, the list goes on. It's an incredible lineup. And at the top, Magnus Carlsen, incredibly, is playing in this tournament. He doesn't need to, and I think it's a very brave decision because, of course, the top two players will qualify for the candidates. Well, Carlsen, as world champion, has no interest in qualifying for the candidates tournament. So, really interesting decision that he's decided to play. Of course, potentially, he could actually knock out one of his rivals if he didn't want them to be challenging for the world title. Anyway, let's take a look at this first round. In each round, players play 2 games against their particular opponent. And if it's 1-1 after those 2 classical games, then they play a tiebreak. But more on the tiebreak later. So, round 1. There are a few mismatches. Carlsen, for example, was playing a Nigerian player, Oluwafemi Balogun, who's only rated 2255. Now, normally I wouldn't be interested in these kind of games, but actually I found this encounter really instructive for all kinds of reasons. So let's take a look. Carlsen with the white pieces, and his opponent plays a Piet modern. And Carlsen goes for this variation, bishop c4, which actually has an excellent reputation. Queen e2, so sometimes white can push really quickly with e5. That's the idea of playing queen e2. And I think Balogun reacts very well with knight c6, exploiting the fact that the queen has moved from the d file and the d pawn is therefore unprotected. So this has been seen before. And now bishop g4, another excellent move. This is a good reaction from black. So pressure on d4, Carlsen defends. And now Carlsen, after 6 minutes thought, bagged the bishops with h3, which is all well and good. The only problem is that white has consumed a lot of time in doing this. You can see that black is pretty well developed, whereas white's queenside pieces are still sitting at home, and I think black reacts very well now by hitting out in the centre with e5. So suddenly, before white can consolidate his centre and his advantage of the 2 bishops, black is hitting out at white's centre. Very good idea. So if pawn takes pawn, then knight takes, and black will get the 2 bishops back. He'll eliminate one of white's bishops. Rook d1 defends the d pawn. It's keeping the tension. And good move from black, I think. Queen e8. So takes the queen away from the rook on the d file. And now just puts a little bit more pressure on the e pawn. So Carlsen decides to close the position. After 11 minutes thought, he was obviously, still feeling his way through this position. And I think that's a small victory for black, because with the centre closed, then this bishop isn't such a good piece. And now the game takes on the character of a King's Indian with this locked pawn centre. Of course, black would still like to have his light squared bishop, but still, he's ahead in development to some extent and can try and push forward at f5. So let's see how this works out. Carlsen preempts that with queen e2, knight h5, so perhaps looking to play into the f4 square and certainly looking to break with the standard move f5. Bishop e5 after 7.5 minutes thought from Carlsen. So he's a little bit, just feeling his way through this position, certainly not playing very quickly at this stage. And he's hoping that c6 will be provoked here, but that would give white a lot of pressure on the centre, and suddenly, you know, this f5 break isn't so important when there's pressure on these pawns. But good reaction from Balogun, plays queen c8, stepping out of the way, and Carlsen develops. About time. The bishop is pushed back, and f5. So after 15 moves, we're already reaching quite a critical phase of the game where White has to decide how he's going to deal with this kingside push, particularly as his queenside play isn't very well advanced, and you know his pieces, you know, rook on a1 is out of the game, and black is well developed. So Carlsen decides to play the bishop back and just hold the e4 pawn for the moment. And again, a critical moment in the game where black has to decide how he's going to proceed on the king side. And I think this is a really instructive moment in the game. And I think after Balogun's next move, Carlsen would have been very, very happy. Not that he's better, but anyway, we'll come on to that in a second. I think the most unpleasant way for black to play the position, I mean, most unpleasant for Carlsen, would be to hold the tension in the position. To play, for example, knight f6. To put some pressure here. So already black is threatening to, well, exchange on e4 and get back the two bishops. So for example, after knight c4, then black can trade here. Trade again. So he's got rid of that light squared bishop. Play queen f5. I think black is pretty comfortable here. I think this trade, for example, will give black a nice pawn center. If f3, then, well, a few ways that black can play this. I mean, one very straightforward way is to play like this, and just to exchange on e4, play the knight back, perhaps with the idea of knight f6 to attack the e-pawn, perhaps also just trading off the so-called bad bishop on g7. And White's queenside play is not very well developed here. That's one option. So I quite like knight f6. Of course, Carlsen could take on f5, but once again, black certainly has decent play there with these nice pawns. And another way would be to exchange on e4 straight away and then just bring the knight back. Perhaps, you know, with some kind of idea like rook f7, queen f8, and again trading off that bad bishop with bishop h6. I don't like knight f4 here, because I think that would be traded, even though one of those bishops is now gone, but after rook e1 there are some sensitive squares on the e-file here. But yeah, I think knight f6 is the most reliable move in this position. Instead, Balogun played f4, and I think Carlsen would have been delighted to see that move. It's the classic King's Indian move, and that's actually, objectively, I don't think too bad. But it resolves the tension, and it makes it easier for White to play. So Carlsen played queen g4. And here, again, I think Black's next move was strategically a mistake, or just practically a mistake. I think it would be best to hold the tension to avoid the queen exchange and play this kind of position. If the queen goes in, it's actually in danger of being trapped with moves like knight f5 and rook e8 and so on. So I think after knight f6 hitting the queen should go back. And now I think, you know, Black continues in the very standard King's Indian way with h5 and g5 and g4 and so on. And this is a proper fight. You know, it's an interesting game. Certainly, you know, Carlsen would not like to be under pressure. after the exchange of queens, I can imagine that came as a great relief, or some relief to Carlsen. I'm not saying he's worse in that other position, I'm just saying this makes life a lot easier. And it was noticeable now that in the moves, you know, say, well, right through these opening moves, these first 17 moves, Carlsen was taking his time. But now, for the next 10 moves, basically all of his moves were made in a minute or so, or under, or just a few seconds. So G5. Carlsen is now on autopilot with the queen exchange, because he has a lovely space advantage, and his queenside play is really easy. He just needs to contain black a little bit on the king side. We'll come on to that in a second. So Balogun does well here to get some counterplay on the king side, like this. But still, Carlsen was playing very, very quickly. His moves, you know, he can play these moves very easily. So the idea of this is just to block black out. But in fact, it's still not completely clear, as we're about to see. So this is good play from black. So the bishop is activating. And knight g6, the knight comes into the game. And Carlsen is still playing incredibly quickly. And I think that must have been extremely disconcerting for the Nigerian player. But it's actually not that clear. And here, again, Carlsen was kind of on autopilot. So he played a5. And, you know, he's breaking through on the queen side. But here is a critical moment. And Balogun now played b5 extremely quickly, which is probably not the best move. I mean, it's a very natural move, very automatic move to keep the queenside as closed as possible for as long as possible. But in fact, this slightly ugly positional move, taking on a5, would buy black a little bit more time. And the idea is to play rook h4. Now, if this is taken, it's a very unclear position. Objectively, white may be better here, but of course black always has counterplay with this pawn here, sitting on h2. You know, it's absolutely not clear. Okay, what if white avoids the trade and plays, let's say, c4? Well, rook here forces white to make a decision. Do you move away? But then suddenly this is serious counterplay. And don't forget, a knight can come in as well. So you can take. Again, pawn takes is not that clear. But in fact, knight takes is a really interesting move, with the idea of actually taking on f3. Typical King's Indian. So if king f3, then whoops, suddenly a mate threatened, the bishop's threatened. And if rook takes, then again, massively unclear position. I think I would favour black there, actually. So in fact, black was still alright here, but I think he was intimidated by the fact that Carlsen was playing so quickly. And, well, again, rook h4 isn't so clear, but now Carlsen starts to break open on the queen side. If pawn takes, then b5 just takes the initiative, and suddenly this is threatened. The a pawn is running. After c6, it gets worse. That's nice to cover the d4 square, and suddenly it's just gone completely. Carlsen breaks through, and here black resigned. Well, at the moment Carlsen is a pawn up. If knight takes pawn, then check, and bishop e5 hits the rook, hits the knight, and that is the end of the game. So really, knight f5, it's completely finished for black here. But if one plays through this game very, very quickly, then you'd think that black was simply crushed without any counterplay. But, well, I hope I've shown that actually that wasn't the case, and that there were some critical moments in the game where black could have found decent counterplay. But the position after the queens were traded, certainly Carlsen was in his element. But I think it's here, and I think this is a real lesson for, well, games where a much weaker player is playing against a stronger player. Stronger players like endgames and they like fixed structures, whereas if black keeps the tension, it's really not so clear, and white can't play on autopilot. There were a couple of upsets in the first game of the first round. The biggest one was Wei Yi losing in 24 moves to Bartor Sambuev, who's a Russian who emigrated to Canada. He now represents Canada. That was a real shock. So can Wei Yi fight back? We'll find out soon.